Now, there's certain things that I think all of us can look at that we have habits that we develop over the years. And, they're kind of unique habits. But sometimes it's interesting to step back and reflect on where those habits started, where they came from. For example, early in my marriage, I developed a habit where if I have an early meeting, if I have some kind of an early meeting that that's early in the morning before Sandy wakes up, I'll go and I'll set out all my clothes, pick them out, set them out, the night before, so they're ready to go in the next morning. And it was interesting. I know that's not an unusual habit, but I was thinking about where that came from, and I was remembering Sandy and I were married in West Palm Beach, Florida, and early in our marriage, we had been in this little condo, and the bedroom had the closet right next to it. It was, right there as part of it. And so I remember that, especially there, we had every Tuesday morning, I had a men's study at 6:30 in the morning. Every once in a while, I'd have another meeting, and it would be the type of thing where I'd be up and out before Sandy was awake. And so as a young husband, I would want to be sensitive to my wife, and so I would try to pick out my clothes, kind of in the dark, looking through the closet, and so I didn't wake her up. But what I'd often find is that the clothes that looked like they matched in the dark didn't so much when I got into the light. So I'd go to the study and suddenly I'm looking, I was like, oh man, that doesn't match. And then the sun would come up and it would even be worse. And it's kind of like, how did I put those things together? And they didn't match at all. And so, when I realized I'd been doing that so often, that's where I finally said, okay, I've got to get up the night before, go and look when the lights are on, choose things that actually hopefully match. And so it started that habit. Now, so you might look at me and you say, well, I still see you sometimes. You don't always necessarily match. And well, that's not because of doing it in the dark. That's just because I don't have any sense of color. And so, I'm not the most stylish person, so every once in a while, some of you who are older, you might remember they used to have something called draminos for kids. And that was like they would give kids these clothes that would have different animals, and they would tell you kids, just match the giraffe with the giraffe, and then they match. And well, now Sandy goes through my clothes, and she tries to match, draminos for me. And even a couple weeks ago, I had something that just didn't match at all, and she's looking at it, and she said, here's the problem. That's a giraffe, that's a penguin. These aren't even the same animals. These aren't the same continents. It's just kind of like, pay attention to what I do here. But generally, I've gotten a little better, and so you see the idea of using light. And that's why all of us, when you go in the bathroom, generally our bathrooms have bright lights in front of the mirrors. So we see what matches. We see what looks good. We see if we've got stuff in our teeth. We see the truth. It reveals the truth, and it gives us a chance to take that action. Well, it's not only getting ready. We understand that to be the case when we're traveling somewhere. If you're outside in the dark and you're trying to walk some kind of path, if you're in the midst of dark, you're gonna trip over things. You're gonna miss the turnoff in the path that you needed to go. If you have bright lights, that not only exposes the dangers, that helps you make sure you're on the right path. Now, it's because we understand something of the nature of light, we can take a passage like this and we can connect to kind of its basic meaning. When Jesus said here in verse 12, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, will have the light of life. We understand that the basic imagery, that he is a light, that he exposes truth, that he helps us to discover the way to go, that if we understand we will not walk in darkness, we will not be lost, but we'll have the light of life that guides us to the path of true life, which is an incredible idea. But in the midst of that, so often it can be something where because part of it is so obvious, we can jump to conclusions and we can maybe not go deeper. And what we realize that if we spend a little more time, what we find is that there are things that are deeper there, things that are to be discovered. And what I want to do is to dig a little deeper. And what we're going to find right off the bat is when Jesus says, I am the light of the world, he actually is making an incredible claim. He's claiming to be God. He's claiming to be God who is our guiding light. Now, this is something where, again, you might read this at first and you may not see this right away. And the reason is it's something that is kind of evident when we look at the whole passage. Even on Sunday morning, what we tend to do is we tend to look at sections. We look at, a couple verses at a time, maybe 10, 20 verses. But there are times that we're looking at the trees and we miss something that's in the forest. And this is a case where if you read like chapters at a time, you would see certain themes that are running through these chapters. You see, all the way back in the beginning of chapter 7, we're told that this, it kind of sets up the whole scene that runs through chapter 7 and 8. And we're told there in the beginning of chapter 7 that all of this takes place during a festival called the Festival of, or Feast of Booths, or the Feast of the Tabernacles. And it was one of the great feasts of the Jewish people. They would have a couple feasts that were kind of the central celebrations of the year. And this was this annual Jewish celebration that was focused on remembering and celebrating how God took care of the Jewish people while they were in the wilderness, that 40 years that they were wandering in the wilderness. And during the feast, the people would all come to Jerusalem, but then they would set up these tents, and they would live outside in these tents during the whole week of the feast. And it was a way of remembering that while they were in the wilderness, they lived in tents. They lived in booths because they were wandering in the wilderness. So now, that's the context. In fact, we go to John 7:37, and we're told that Jesus began this big part of this message on the last day of that feast. On the last day of the feast of the booths, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink." And so it's right there. And so now when we come to chapter 8, we're looking at either the last day of the feast or the day when the feast has just ended. And so we've got to keep this in mind as we're going to see the images of the feast. These people have just celebrated this. The images are fresh in their mind, and what he says is given a greater understanding, greater meaning and significance if you understand the whole feast. Not only that, but it's worth noting where this happened. Again, this is just a little detail that it's easy to overlook, but it comes clear when you understand everything. Look at verse 20. I'm going to put it up here. These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. So we're told that it was a treasury. The treasury was the place where the offering boxes were. It was a part of the temple called the Court of Women. And along the sides of the Court of Women, there were these offering boxes. And again, that's going to become significant in just a minute. Now, the most celebrated and meaningful part of the festival was a great ceremony celebrated each night called the illumination of the temple. It was a celebration of light. And so when we see Jesus saying he's the light, we've got to see this claim in this context of the celebration of light. Now remember, the whole Feast of the Booths was all about celebrating and remembering how God took care of God's people while they were in the wilderness. And one aspect of that provision was that while they were in the wilderness, God's presence was there and God guided them through a glory cloud. So in the daytime, there was this cloud that would stay over them, and if God wanted it to move, it would move, and they would just stay under that cloud. And then during nighttime, when they couldn't see the cloud, God would then appear to them as a pillar of fire, kind of this cloud of fire. And again, so there was this great cloud of fire that would remind them of God's presence, of God's care. It would guide them in the midst of the dark of the wilderness, that it would direct them so that they would know the right way to go. And the highlight of the festival was a celebration of this pillar of fire. Every night they would come together and they would come to the temple, and part of this, they would have this incredibly huge oil lamps. There were 4 oil lamps that were 75 feet tall. Now that's taller than this roof. These are incredibly, huge. And they would stand up there, and now again, we don't have like pictures of this. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. But there are some artists that have tried to kind of paint pictures of this. And so here you have this idea, these huge oil lamps, 75 feet tall. And what's significant is it was in the Court of Women. In fact, if you look at that, it's on the outside there, and the colonnades on the outside right past that is where the treasury was. So when Jesus steps up and talks, and it says that he was in the treasury, it means that he was standing right under these great lamps. Now, what do we know about this lamp? Every night they would have this celebration. They would have people that literally climb up ladders, and they'd say they'd have these huge containers with 10 gallons of oil. They would fill these lamps with oil. They would light them and have this incredible celebration with music and dancing. And they would have these incredible celebrations. And again, we can't necessarily know exactly what it would look like, but some people have kind of guessed, this incredible light, these huge lamps. And they said it not only lit up the temple, but it was so bright that it literally lit up the whole city of Jerusalem. They said there wasn't anywhere in Jerusalem that you would go that you wouldn't have some of the light from the temple cast over to you. So here you have this picture of this incredible celebration. It's just ended. Jesus is standing under these lampposts that talk about the celebration of the pillar of fire, and he's right there, and he says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And do you see that there's meaning here? So if you understand that, there's meaning that comes from the context. And so when he says, I am the light of the world, the obvious thing is he's saying, I am the pillar of fire. What you're celebrating, that God came in a pillar of fire, that's me. I am the God that you're worshiping. I'm the one that appeared in a pillar of fire. I'm the one that gave light and direction to the people in the midst of the darkness of the wilderness. But not only is he claiming to be the God who provided light then, he says, I am the light of the world. He's saying, I am the one who will continue to be light. I am the one that provides light and direction now. You see, what he's saying is that you've got to understand that there's a claim here, but there's a scope and an impact of the claim that goes beyond just looking backward. That's part of it. This was a feast that looked backward and said, here's what God did then. And he's saying, I am that same God, but I'm not only the God who provided light and direction then, but I'm also the light God that comes and offers direction now. Because they needed it then. They were lost in the wilderness and it was dark. But you know what? We still live in a world where there's darkness and confusion and people are lost. And he says, no, I am. And the fact that he claims to be that light is all rooted in the sense that he's saying, I'm claiming to be God. It's because I am the God who appeared then. That's the reason I'm the light that can give hope and direction to anyone and all people now. Now, here's one thing that's important, though, that we've got to see, especially relevant in the context of our culture. Look at what he says. I am the light of the world. He claims to be the light, not just a light. He's not saying, I'm a source of light, that if you're lost, you can come to me, and there's many places where you can find direction and hope, and I'm one of them. I'm a reliable source. No, he says, I am the light. I am the only source. Now, again, I understand that in our culture, that's an offensive claim. Because in our culture, people will say, well, no, you can claim that that's a light, that's your light, that's truth to you, but for me to say that, this is the light, that this is truth for everyone, this is the only way, this is the only truth, well, that's offensive. That's just your light, this is my light. But I want you to see, Jesus doesn't leave us that option. He doesn't come and say, well, I am a light, or you can choose. He says, I am the light of the world. I am the only light of the world. This is clearly Jesus' claim. I'm the only source. See, this is actually something that it's a theme that Jesus isn't just claiming here. It's a theme that runs throughout the whole Gospel of John. Let's go back to the very beginning of the Gospel. Look at how John started his story of Jesus. Back in John chapter 1, look at how he begins his gospel. He starts off and he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. For those that were with us way back when we started the Gospel of John, the word here in English translated word is a really unique word from the Greek. It's the word logos. And it has way more of a meaning of just meaning a word of language. It actually was a word that spoke about philosophy. It was a philosophical word. And so the Greek philosophers would debate the logos, meaning what was the answer to the big questions of life. And that's what logos was. It was the ultimate questions of life, the ultimate answers. Who are we? Why do we exist? What is the meaning of life? Why are we here? How do we find fulfillment? How do we find happiness? How do we find meaning? And here John's saying is in the beginning you have Jesus, who was the logos. Jesus is the answer to all the questions that we would ask. He's the answer to the big questions in life. Why? Because he was God. He was with God. He was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Without him was not anything made that was made. Here's what he's saying. He's the answer because he's the designer. He's the one that designed life. And he says, okay, if you align with the way that life is designed to work, the more that you align yourself, the more that it's going to work. Because it's aligning with what's true. So it's in that context, then we read then in verse 4, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. In him, in a relationship with him and who he came, only there do we find life. Only where do we find our purpose in life, where we find our design in life. And it's that design that gives us a light. So if you want to know what's true, we've got to go to Christ. We've got to go to who he is, what he came to do, what he taught. Even when you look at issues not only of relationship with God, issues of morality. You know, what's right and wrong? How do we live life? What's true? He's saying, no, he is life. It's something that is life because it's an expression of the way we're designed. See, it's the way that we're designed to work. It's kind of like saying if something's designed to work, you can't just, make it up and say, well, this sounds like it worked to me. No, you got to follow the guidelines. You got to follow the rules. You can't just, you have a lawnmower. We blew it out last week because I didn't, I taught my kids how to mow the lawn. I didn't teach them how to check the oil. And the thing is, you don't put oil in the lawnmower, it doesn't work. Because you got to follow the rules. You got to follow the design. And as much as I can be really sincere, the fact is that if I don't do it the right way, it's going to break. And that's true of us as people. It's true of morality. And the fact that when you say, well, if something is true, it isn't true defined by truth, whether we like it or whether we think it's true or whether our culture thinks. Our belief about what's true is radically different than the culture 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and it might be different 100 years from now. The fact is, what's true has never changed. What's true is an expression of God and what he has created. And the fact is that if we as individuals, if we as a culture, the more that we align with who God is, with his truth, with his light, with his life, the more life will work. Because we're aligning ourselves with the Logos, with what's true. So Jesus is the light that we need. He's the only one that will give us direction for what's true. And now if we come back and we see 12, there's an implication with that though. What does he say? I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Now, there's a statement, if you follow me, you won't walk in darkness. Why? Because you'll have light. Now, the implication of that is obviously true on the opposite. Meaning, if you do not follow me, you will walk in darkness because you will not have the light. And so what he's saying here, as Jesus is saying, is that we all have a choice. We have a choice of whether to follow Jesus, whether to pursue him, whether to live life by his light, or whether to choose darkness. And again, I recognize that sounds judgmental, and that sounds, well, how could you say that? And again, my friends, what we've got to realize is that this is not my opinion. This is not my words. This is what Jesus is saying. Here's the one that is saying that I am the Logos, I am the designer. And because of that, I am the answer to life's great questions. And if you align yourself with me, then life is going to work because you're aligning yourself with the light. You're putting yourself under light. But on the other hand, if you don't, your life isn't going to work. Now, the thing is a lot of times we come to the light and we may not like it. We may not like a statement like this. Why? Because a light reveals. It not only reveals what is true, but it reveals what is broken. And the fact that all of us have sin natures, all of us have things that are in our life that when I come to God, when I come to Jesus, when I come to the Bible, it's going to reveal things in me that are wrong. And the question is, okay, then am I going to try to argue against God, or am I going to say, okay, God, it reveals what's broken, it needs to be fixed? The problem is that our nature is to want to reject it. Look what Jesus even said about this earlier in John chapter 3. He used some very, very similar language about being the light. And look at what he says, John 3:19. And this is the judgment, The light has come into the world, and the people love the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. He says, I realize that I've come into the world, and there are people that don't like me, that don't like my message. Why? Because there's something in there that when the light comes, it exposes that they want to hide. Verse 20, for everyone who does wicked things hates the light. Now, who's everyone that does wicked things? All of us. All of us have a sin nature. All of us have things that are wrong in our life. So we hate the light and we don't come into the light lest his work should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. See, here's the thing, is that as the light, Jesus exposes God's holiness. He exposes truth. But any time that he exposes truth and God's holiness, it also exposes our sinfulness and our brokenness. And again, as a result, it's our nature to want to run away from that, to reject Jesus Christ, to reject his message, his light. Because there are times that it's offensive. It steps on our toes. It says things that we don't like. But here's what we have to realize. If God's word offends, if it exposes sin, it doesn't expose sin to condemn. But it exposes our brokenness and our sinfulness to invite to God's healing. You see, Jesus Christ is the light, and he speaks to those that are broken, and he says, I come to bring life. I come to bring the life that you long for. And yes, there are going to be times that I'm going to show you the ugliness of your sin, not to show you that and reject you, but to show you that you need to come to me and you need to be healed. And you know what? We have in our culture pressure even on churches to say, oh, you don't talk about sin. Don't make people feel guilty. That's offensive. And the fact is that the gospel, part of the gospel is that the bad news is that we're lost. And the good news is that Jesus Christ is pursuing us to be found. The bad news is that we're broken. The good news is that Jesus Christ is the great physician that came to heal us. The bad news is that we have sinned. We deserve God's wrath and his punishment. The good news is that Jesus Christ came and died on the cross to take our sin and to take that punishment so that he could forgive us and give us relationship with Christ. And yes, there's a sense that you say, okay, we're choosing between light and darkness. We're choosing between Jesus Christ and brokenness. But we realize that everything that it's revealing a light that leads us to a path of life. Again, look at verse 12. Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And what is that life? Well, first of all, that we are sinners, that God created. He designed us for relationship with God. But that relationship was broken because of our sinfulness. And we can't fix that. None of us can be good enough to fix it. I can't keep the rules. No. But Jesus Christ came to restore that which was broken. He came to die on the cross so that the sin that separated me and you from God could be removed through his forgiveness and through his grace. And when we have a relationship that's restored with God, then what happens is it gives us life. It helps us to discover a path of light that gives us life. And that life is discovering in the Logos our meaning for life. It's learning the truth that we say, okay, how do we live and discover the meaning, the significance, the happiness, the joy that we're created for? The more that I align myself with Christ, the more I discover that. Why? Because we're aligning ourselves with what is true, with the way that we are created. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, we've got like 10 minutes left, and he's just gotten through the first verse, and it's like, okay, it's been a long message, and we're going to go through this last part because you might have even read this and it seems like verse 12, I'm the light of the world, that's the center verse, and then the rest of it doesn't seem to match. And what I want you to see is that everything actually flows from that verse. Verse 12 is the main verse, and everything else is that the people are listening to that and they react against it. They argue against him. And they have these religious leaders start arguing against Jesus and they try to distract him. And every time they do, Jesus turns it back and he says, okay, let's talk about, I'm the light of the world. Why? Because I'm God. Are you going to respond to me? The first argument starts in verse 13. The Pharisees said to him, you are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true. Basically, he's saying, you can say anything. Anybody can say anything. Why should we believe you just because you say it? And Jesus' response is that we all need to find a truth that's outside of ourselves. So when we look at this, it's interesting. They say, well, you're just bearing truth by yourself. If you go back to chapter 7, We see in chapter 7, numerous times it's recorded about evidences that give testimony to the truthfulness of Christ. In 7:31, we're told because of his miracles, people believed in Jesus. In verses 41 and 42, we're told that there was a testimony of how he fulfilled prophecy, that gave evidence to the truthfulness of Jesus. In verse 45 and 46, we're told about these officers that came to arrest Jesus, and they said, no one's ever spoke like this man. His teaching gives evidence that he's unique, that he's who he claims that he is. But what's amazing is that Jesus doesn't refer to any of these things. They're like, why should we believe you? And look at what he says instead, verse 14. He answered, even if I do bear witness about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I come from and where I'm going, but you do not know where I come from or where I'm going. You judge according to the flesh, I judge no one. But even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. Now, one of the things that's true is that when you think about the testimony of anybody, you're basically judging something of the testimony of what they say based on the validity of the person, right? So you'd have many people that have told you something, and you tend to believe this person because you trust them. You don't believe this person. I think about even for those of us who have young kids. I remember when my kids were younger, my oldest had an incredible imagination. She lived in her own imaginary world. In fact, I always remember one day, she's 2 years old, and we're driving somewhere, and she said, Dad, people change. And I'm like, man, that's a deep sentence for a 2-year-old. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, when I'm Cinderella, you're the prince. But when I'm Belle, you're the beast. And it's kind of like, everybody changes to my world. And that's the mind that she lived in. Now, here you have this little girl. Now, if she came to me like 5 minutes before bedtime and came to me with fear and she said, Dad, aliens came and there's a monster in my room, I'm not calling the police. The fact is that I have the testimony of someone who I love, but I don't necessarily put all that credibility in the 2-year-old testimony. Now, here's what you have to realize. That's true of anybody. So they come to Jesus and they say, why should we believe you just because of what you're saying? And he could say, here's all the evidences, but he said, let me give you a better one. Consider who's testifying. I'm God. All right, now if you could have various people come and give all kinds of evidence and you judge whether they're right or wrong, if you have God come and speak, it's kind of hard to trump that one. Whenever God says something is true, that's basically what he's saying. Yeah, I can speak, and my testimony, when I say this is true, that's way more powerful than all these other evidences that were in chapter 7. But not only that, but then he says, okay, the law says that you need 2. Well, okay, let's go to 2. Well, it's not only me, but I've got the Father. I've got my Father. So I've got God the Father, God the Son, and he's pointing back to the baptism when he's baptized, and God speaks from heaven and said, this is my Son in whom I'm well pleased. And he's saying, okay, if you really want testimony, you can't beat that. But the problem was for them, we see in verse 15, you judge according to the flesh. In other words, you don't have spiritual life, so you can't see the truth. I think the idea is you're judging according to your wisdom, what makes sense to you. Paul talked about this in 1 Corinthians 1:18. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved is the power of God. Saying you're blind leading the blind. And you have God appearing to you right now, and you can't see it because all you see is what makes sense in your little box. You can't see it. And what you realize is if you're blind, if you're in the dark, you will not find the way on your own. You need a light from the outside. You need God to come, the Logos, the Creator, to come and reveal what is real. And I'm doing that. You're missing it because you don't want to see outside of your own wisdom. My friends, that's, again, so many people reject Christ because we don't want to go outside of our own wisdom. But the problem is that ultimately truth is about God, and we will never be able to find God outside of Jesus Christ. He is the light. Look what he continues to say. Verse 18, I am the one who bears witness about myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness about me. Therefore they said to him, where is your Father? And Jesus answered, you neither know me nor the Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. It says nobody arrested him there. Why? Because he was claiming to be God. That was a cause to be arrested. And it's common for today, I hear people, and many of you probably have too, people say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. How many times have we heard that? I have a relationship with God, but it's kind of my own thing. I do my own thing, my own way, and I do it through my own. And here you have Jesus saying this. You claim to be spiritual. You claim to be students of the Bible. But the fact is that you don't know God because you cannot know God without knowing me. You cannot know God without knowing me. Now, this is something that, again, Jesus says many other times. I'll give you one other. John 14:6. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. My friends, again, I know that you might be there and say, well, I'm trying, I'm doing this. You cannot know God apart from Jesus Christ. You cannot know God's truth apart from Jesus Christ. And again, if that seems offensive, if that's not my wisdom, it's not my opinion, that's what Jesus himself is saying. If Jesus is God, he's saying this is the only way. And so we look at this and we say, okay, then if that's true, we've got to recognize that if we reject Jesus Christ, there are eternal consequences to that rejection. Look at what he says now in verse 21. He said to them again, I'm going away and you'll seek me and you'll die in your sin. Where I'm going, you cannot come. Now, the key statement seems to be there, you'll die in your sin, right? But they totally miss it. Look at verse 22. So the Jews said to him, will he kill himself since he says, where I'm going, you can't come? They don't want to hear what he's saying. So they choose to focus on other things. So he comes back in verse 23. He said, you are from below, I am from above. You are of this world, I'm not of this world. You're trying to figure it out according to your wisdom, so that's where you're missing it. But here's what you've got to realize. I told you that you will die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. What he's saying is that, again, we're created for a relationship with God, that our sin separates us. And my friends, what we've got to realize is that Jesus is really clear. Apart from accepting God's grace through Jesus Christ, his sacrifice at the cross where he took our sins, we will die in our sins. And who is he talking to here? He's talking to religious people. Good people who are focused on rules, keeping rules. And he's saying, no, the only way that you're going to be saved, it isn't by being good. It isn't trying hard. It isn't by, any of those things. It's by recognizing our hope isn't in religion, isn't in performance. It's in acknowledging that we could never undo our own sin. And so we come to Christ and we say, God, I need you to forgive me through Jesus Christ. I need his grace. I need his forgiveness. And when we come to Christ, what we find is that forgiveness and that grace. And it's not only that forgiveness and grace, but that's what's key, is it opens then and restores all aspects of life. Why? Because when you look at the whole fall, God created us for this perfect world. And then what happened? We fell and our relationship with God was broken and everything else began to break. Our understanding of every other relationship, every other aspect of life began to break. And what happens is when we have a relationship with God that's fixed, when we say, God, I recognize my sin and sinfulness, I ask you to forgive me. God, I ask you to now be Lord of my life. God, I recognize that I need Jesus, who is God, who is my logos, my designer, and I give him the right of Lord of my life. What happens is the more that I align myself with that truth, the more life works. The more that I live in light and let it expose what is true and what is false and change my life accordingly, the more that I find the path of life that he promises. That he is the light of the world. Whoever follows in him will not walk in darkness. But as we walk in his light, there we will find life. Now look at what he says to wrap this up. In verse 30, he says, as he was saying these things, many believed him. And so verse 31, he said to the Jews who believed in him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Now, it's not just those who heard or thought, and it says, no, these who believed in him, who trusted in him. And how do we do that? By abiding in his word, by truly, making him, following his light. And he said, if you do that, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I can tell you at first, we're going to look at this verse more next week, but at first you read it and say, how does that interact with the light? And you know what I think it is? It's really just restating verse 12. He's saying the exact same thing through just different words. I am the light of the world. Anyone who follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. When he comes, why is he the light of the world? Because he is truth. And his truth exposes what is true. And anyone who not only knows that truth, but abides in it, lives in it, walks in him, what happens is we will know the truth and we will find life, defined here as that truth will set you free. See, it talks about there's a relationship between this light and truth and freedom. And what is that? That light reveals the truth. It's not always truth that we like. It's not always truth that is we want, but it's truth that we need. And it's always true that if we align ourselves with it, it always works. Now, I know even in the statement that the truth will set you free, to some that might almost sound counterintuitive. You know, when we think of the light, we think of, okay, what is true and what reveals what is right and wrong. Why? Because it's an expression of God's character. It's an expression of what's true, how God made the world to work. And when we align ourselves with what's true, it's right. When we don't, it's wrong. Now, anything that teaches absolute morality, things are always right, things are always wrong, sometimes people will look at that and say, that's not the source of truth, that's the source of law, restriction. You know, in fact, probably the main reason I talk to people, why do you not want to follow Christ? Well, I don't want to follow the rules. I don't want to surrender my life. I don't want to surrender to his control. If I do that, I lose freedom. Here's what I need to remind you of. He is the Logos. He is our God creator. He knows what we were designed for. For those that think that pursuing freedom is doing whatever we want, pursuing the desires of our heart, our body, of our flesh, of what I've got to point out is that that's not freedom at all. You see, people who choose this path, they're not free. And some of you might be here, you're not free. You're really slaves to your desire. It's not that you're free to pursue those things, you have to pursue those. It's like I'm finding meaning, and the only thing that I know how to do is that I feel like this will be good. I want to do it. And what happens is that we pursue the things that our body or that our heart is telling us what we want, even as we see those very things destroy us. And I've seen this so often that you have people that are totally passionate about pursuing something that even deep down when I say, I know this isn't good for me, but I think it's going to make me happy. And the ultimate example of that is drug addiction. You have people that are so addicted to drugs, and I've got to have that. They're driven towards that. That's what I need, even as it's destroying their life. My friends, all kind of sin is just a kind of an addiction. It's the same thing. And here's what happens is that the truth, Jesus reveals the truth. Yes, at times it steps on our toes, but when we understand the truth and we align ourselves with Christ, he not only reveals that, but he forgives us for where we go wrong. And then he says, okay, now I'm going to give you the strength to be able to make other decisions. So that, God, when I ask you to change my life, forgive me, change my heart, you know what he does? He gives me the ability to not only see what's true, but there are times I want to do something that's right or wrong. My body wants to do something, and I say, well, I know I want to do that, but I know it's not right. I know it's destructive. Now I don't have to do that anymore. I don't have to sin. I'm free to say no to those things because I know that while they may bring temporary pleasure, they're going to bring ultimate destruction. And so now I'm free to choose sin or not to choose sin. I have freedom to choose a path that, yes, says no in the short term to pleasure, but says yes in the long term to meaning in life and significance, because the truth sets me free. My friends, I want you to realize that that's an invitation that God gives to every one of us today, that he is the light of the world, that he invites all who would come to him. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Whoever believes in me will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. You may be here and you know him, you have that relationship, and parts of your life are out of line with that, and you know it is. You're trying to do your own thing. And the more that you get out of line with God's truth, the more that life isn't going to work. Are you willing to say, God, I need you to be the center of my life? You may not have ever had that relationship with Christ. My friends, when Christ talks about what's right and wrong, it isn't to condemn, it's to show our need to invite us to his healing. And so if he's speaking to you today, he's not stepping on toes in a sense to try to hurt you. He's stepping on toes to say, if you realize that you're sick, I want to make you aware that there's a healer. If you realize that all these things that you're pursuing in life that you think you have freedom, you don't have freedom. All the things that you're pursuing in life, they aren't satisfying. They aren't the logos, they aren't the answer. And Jesus says, I'll be the answer. Will you come to me? Will you trust in me? If you do so, I'll meet you here today. I'll forgive your sins. I'll give you this relationship with God. I'll be the light that gives you truth and helps you to live in freedom. Thanks for joining us. If you have any questions about what we talked about, Jesus Christ, our church, or anything else, connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or by email. We'd love to hear from you.